All right, good evening, guys. Welcome to episode 28 of this vlog series. It's crazy to think that we are creeping up on 30-ish, or close to 30 straight days of this project. So coming up on almost a full month, which is pretty wild to think that a conversation that happened to initiate this has set in motion a full month of this, and it's been pretty interesting. It's opened up, I think, a lot of new compartments of my own brain, again, just forcing myself to sit down every night and put some words and thoughts out in the universe. And so with that being said, which seems to be a phrase that I fall back on regularly, I will dive back in to The Constitution of Liberty by Friedrich von Hayek, chapter 4. So I've done the first 3 chapters and have really enjoyed it, and I think gotten a fair amount out of pulling some highlighted portions out of it. So I figured, what the heck? And to point out maybe again some of the benefits of having started this project is, my goal, and it'll actually be relevant to the chapter we go into tonight, but my goal at times, or kind of thinking long term, ideally you think, oh yeah, I'd love to get smarter on these subjects, I want to read these books, etc., etc. And it's easy to maybe hit one hard and lose steam, and maybe I'm actually just speaking for myself. I find myself, maybe get the first couple chapters of a book, oh, this is great, but then I'm all over the place, and I might latch onto something new and then set it down for a while before getting going. And so with this book, I was part of the way through chapter 4, and I was looking at the clock. All right, I'm gonna have to do my video soon. Well, there's only 5 pages left in the chapter. Let's just finish it up so then I can do a full chapter review tonight. So kind of a self-motivating, self-fulfilling process here. All right, so without further ado, chapter 4 is called Freedom, Reason, and Tradition. The opening quote is one by A.D. Tocqueville, which is a last name I've seen a fair amount, so I'm assuming this guy must be some kind of 18th century philosopher or something like that. But anyhow, he says, "Nothing is more fertile in prodigies than the art of being free, but there is nothing more arduous than the apprenticeship of liberty. Liberty is generally established with difficulty in the midst of storms. It is perfected by civil discords, and its benefits cannot be appreciated until it is already old." And he starts out, not even getting into the highlighted portions, he starts out by saying, though freedom is not a state of nature, but an artifact of civilization, it did not arise from design. The institutions of freedom, like everything freedom has created, were not established because people foresaw the benefits they would bring. But once its advantages were recognized, men began to perfect and extend the reign of freedom, and, for that purpose, to inquire how a free society worked. This development of a theory of liberty took place mainly in the 18th century. It began in 2 countries, England and France. The first of these knew liberty, the second did not. As a result, we have, I may end up reading a fair amount of this because this was a legit chapter. So maybe I'll get through the rest of this paragraph and then start skipping so that this episode isn't 2 hours long. But anyhow, as a result, we have had to the present day 2 different traditions in the theory of liberty, one empirical and unsystematic, the other speculative, and rationalistic. The first, based on an interpretation of traditions and institutions which had spontaneously grown up and were but imperfectly understood. The second, aiming at the construction of a utopia, which has often been tried but never successfully. Nevertheless, it has been the rationalistic, plausible, and apparently logical argument of the French tradition, with its flattering assumptions about the unlimited powers of human reason, that has progressively gained influence, while the less articulate, less explicit tradition of English freedom has been on the decline. So he spends a fair amount of this chapter talking about these kind of two, and I guess it's pretty much the whole theme of the chapter is this tension between the English tradition, which the way he puts it is based on just is more of an observational understanding that institutions within society that allowed freedom and liberty to take place had certain characteristics that they observed. Meanwhile, the French philosophy was more of a philosophy that came from a more rational and articulated and thought out deliberate method as opposed to an observational method. And one thing I'm very interested to learn is more of the specifics of these two traditions and what is he specifically referring to when he's talking about the English tradition. What are those institutions that they were observing? And when he's talking about the French tradition, where were these people getting those ideas from? So the difference was better understood. So since this was written, the French tradition has everywhere progressively displaced the English. Okay, what we have called the, quote, British tradition was made explicit mainly by a group of Scottish moral philosophers led by David Hume, Adam Smith, and Adam Ferguson, seconded by their English contemporaries Josiah Tucker, Edmund Burke, and William Paley, and drawing largely on a tradition of jurisprudence of common law. Okay, that's interesting. So he's talking about it was observations of, or it was drawing largely on the tradition of jurisprudence of common law. Opposed to them was the tradition of the French Enlightenment, deeply imbued with Cartesian rationalism. The encyclopedists and Rousseau, the physiocrats, and Condorcet are their best known representatives. Of course, the division does not fully coincide with national boundaries. Frenchmen like Montesquieu and later Benjamin Constant, and above all Alix de Tocqueville, are probably nearer to what we have called the British than to the French tradition. And in Thomas Hobbes, Britain has provided at least one of the founders of the rationalist tradition, not to speak of the whole generation of enthusiasts for the French Revolution, like Godwin, Presley, Price, and Paine, who, like Jefferson, after a stay in France, belong entirely to it. So he goes on to say that the main contrast in the practical conclusions to which these approaches led has recently put as follows. One finds the essence of freedom in spontaneity and the absence of coercion. The other believes it to be realized only in the pursuit and attainment of an absolute and collective purpose. And one stands for organic, slow, half-conscious growth, and the other for doctrine, deliberateness, one for trial and error procedure, and the other for an enforced, solely valid pattern. So this is an interesting theme that I think just is fundamental to the concept of this book, and he goes into it later in this chapter, which is this idea that basically reality, society, human interaction is complex, and that the individual he hits on it, chapter after chapter, and that it's all complex, and it's impossible for the human mind to deliberately conceive of the the entire kind of reality with which we live, and come up with rules, come up with a deliberate method of solving all of our problems from a kind of centralized and planned place. That some of it has to be spontaneous and organic, and it has to come from unknown pockets of the world and of society. And that doesn't mean, and he makes this point clear near the end of the chapters, that does not mean he's advocating for anti-rationalism, or does not see the value in the tool of reason and logic for humans to use that tool, but he just aims to point out the limits of that tool, and to not get arrogant and think that human reason can solve all of our problems. And he goes on to say, the sweeping success of the political doctrines that stem from the French Revolution is probably due to their great appeal to human pride and ambition. But we must not forget that the political conclusions of the two schools derive from different conceptions of how society works. In this respect, the British philosophers laid the foundations of a profound and essentially valid theory, while the rationalist school was simply and completely wrong. Whoa, okay. So he's essentially saying, one school of thought was correct and the other was incorrect, which is an interesting statement, because I ran into this in a recent interaction online with someone. When I I'll get into a bit of the specifics. We were having a debate about the best form of healthcare, and I've continued to make the claim that I think the more freedom you give people, the more you allow the free market to deliver that service, the better off that we'll all be for it. And you'll have people point and say, oh, well, societies around the world, they all have socialized healthcare or single payer healthcare, and see, look at them, they're all better than us, they have better outcomes, and so on down the line, that we need to go towards more socialism, not less socialism. And so finally I said, okay, well, which list are you using? All right, number one is the healthcare, number one on one of these lists was South Korea. And I think you could do this exercise with any of these countries, and I would think you would find something to be true. Either the quality and of the service isn't all it's cracked up to be, or there's actually free market principles at play that don't immediately meet the eye. And so when you look into it further, yes, South Korea does have a universal universal government health insurance, but it turns out that everyone's has to pay 5% of their income goes towards this health insurance, and it only covers up to 60% of typical healthcare costs. And so around 80, I'm throwing out a lot of numbers, but these are just ones that I remember off the top of my head, around 80% of citizens in South Korea have private health insurance that goes above and beyond the basic coverage that the government provides. And on top of that, there's a tradition of private hospitals. And I got a little bit into the history. There was a lot of freedom in this regard in South Korea. And so there was this massive boom of private hospitals popping up all over the place and private insurers and all this stuff. And so in order to attempt to rein it in or control it to some ways, when they came up with the national health insurance, but a lot of the 90 something percent of the hospitals are still private. So you have a lot of these competitive forces at play that I would imagine are where they derive the benefit from in the best service. And so I was pointing some of these things out to the individual I was debating online, to which he said, okay, sure, but why have you never put out any, content talking about the pros and cons of the free market? And so this point where he says that there's one valid theory, to me, it spoke to the recent bodybuilding program that I've been following. Mike Menser essentially, says that through a scientific approach, you should ultimately reach one valid theory of bodybuilding, or of one valid method of building size and strength in your muscles, which has got me thinking that there are maybe, some areas of life where there is sort of a balance or a pro con, hey, one glass of wine a night isn't bad for you, but if you overdo it, it can be bad for you. There's maybe some of these things where it's like, it can be a little bit good or a little bit bad. But there's also some things where it's like, no, there is a right answer and then there is a wrong answer, right? And so I think, that's where Hayek is making the claim, which is bolder than I would be, but I'm starting to get emboldened. And my response to that individual was that I don't see it as a pro and con when it comes to the free market. I see the idea of allowing people to interact in a voluntary manner as a overriding principle, and that any government action that intervenes in that, prevents that, erodes that, through coercive methods, is like a cancer, right? And so you would never say, oh, okay, well, a little bit of cancer is okay. One glass of cancer a night is fine. No, you would say that's inherently bad. We should operate on, and try and extinguish that cancer that's in your body to allow, the healthy cells within your body to thrive. And so that's what I would say, my philosophy is starting to materialize as, which is these interventions, this central planning, this government coercion and influence over people is like a cancer, and that we should aim to get the cancer out of our body and allow the healthy society to thrive. So with that being said, that's about halfway through the chapter, and we're 20 minutes in, so I don't want to bore people to death. So I'll leave it at that. So we'll call it the first half of chapter 4. Again, I've enjoyed this read. Let me tear off my bookmark and leave it to where I left off, because I know you will all be just patiently waiting for the part 2 of this episode tomorrow. But yeah, that being said, I think through interacting with people online and continuing to study some of these concepts, I'm finding new avenues and arguments, and I'm interested to see where it goes, and appreciate anyone following along. The community and tribe has grown to 5, so I appreciate the 5 of you for tapping in. And yeah, if there's any other, let's leave it at that. I appreciate each and every one of you guys. Hope you have a great rest of your weekend. I hope you're having a good summer, and I will catch you all tomorrow. Cheers.